Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness.
The Bible contains remarkable stories of miracles and divine interventions. Moses parted the sea. Peter healed a man lame from his mother's womb. Jesus drove demons out of people and raised others from the dead. But are these types of events still happening today?
We too have a beam of divine light and guidance that God has put within the heart of every man. And it's one of the greatest proofs that there is a God.
More amazing supernatural things are happening than we realize.
This is Divine Intervention, the interview show that features intriguing people who've experienced the hand of God in amazing ways. Divine Intervention was created and produced with the purpose of encouraging believers, spiritual seekers, and skeptics alike that Jesus is alive and is still performing miracles and working in the world today.
I believe in miracles.
Here's your host, Daniel Fazina.
Hello, friend, and welcome to Divine Intervention Radio. I am your host, Daniel Fazina, and as always, I am so excited and privileged and humbled to be with you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to spend with me here on Divine Intervention Radio. Today we're going to be talking about a theme. We have a theme going on that is law enforcement, actually. We're going to be talking to a cold case homicide detective, none other than J. Warner Wallace, and a first responder, Sergeant Mike McGrew. And both of these guys have pretty awesome testimonies, and God has given them some amazing ministries. And we're going to get to that, but before we do, I want to remind you that you can always catch up on Divine Intervention. If you miss any of the episodes, they are archived at divineinterventionradio.com. Also, facebook.com/Divine Intervention Radio, and youtube.com/Divine Intervention Radio. Please do me a favor, if you go to those sites, like the Facebook page and comment and subscribe on the videos on YouTube. Not only is that going to help us to grow the show and its influence, but you're going to be notified every time a new episode of the show is uploaded. Friend, I want to tell you a little testimony before we get to our special guests. I had a pretty interesting and awesome thing happen to me not too long ago, and it was the day I was recording an episode of Divine Intervention with my friend Reggie Fieldy Arvizu from the rock band Korn. If you want to check out his interview, it's episode number 260. You can check that out on YouTube or on divineinterventionradio.com. But anyway, I was talking to him, and he was talking about his life as a rock star, and when, God got a hold of him and transformed him, delivered him from alcoholism and drugs. And then he talks about his growth and living the Christian life while still being a rock star and being on tour. And he talked about how it was often inconvenient. You have to allow yourself to be inconvenienced to be able to spend time with people who don't know God, don't know Jesus, and just to make time for them. Especially him being a rock star, he doesn't ever have time. He has to make time. And he said, if we're willing to be inconvenienced, God will use us, and he will glorify himself, and he'll draw people to himself. And I thought that was really an awesome thing for him to say, and I just really appreciated that about him, and I prayed about it a little bit. And the very next day, I had an incident that I think is really divine, that it kind of just goes hand in hand with this whole topic that Fieldy and I were talking about. So the next day, my family and I were scheduled to go to England to visit my wife's grandmother, who lives in the UK. We were supposed to go flying from Norfolk, Virginia to New York City, and then from New York City to London. But when we got to the airport in Norfolk, they said our flight was delayed. And there were all these people sitting around, and there was just a lot of people and long delay, and the flight kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And finally, it just got canceled altogether. We had been there at least 3 hours. And now, mind you, we have a 6-month-old child and a 4-year-old child and a lot of luggage because we're going overseas. So it was not a great situation. So my wife and I kind of negotiated with the airline, and they finally they said that the flight was totally canceled because of storms in New York City. So JFK was totally shut down because of lightning storms and stuff. So they were going to reroute us. Okay, fine. So they reroute us to Atlanta, And then from Atlanta, we have to go to Amsterdam. And then from Amsterdam, we finally can get to go to London. And, it was a whole big rigmarole, getting to Amsterdam, another layover, and they lost my daughter's boarding pass, and I had to walk to the other side of the airport. And, this is like hours and hours and hours. And our cab that we had reserved in London, of course, we missed it because we were delayed so long. It was like another, 12 or 13 hours. We were late, maybe more. But what should have taken, 7 or 8 hours took about 24 hours. When we finally get to London Heathrow, the cab had been canceled, and I tried to, reserve a different cab. And I'm on the phone doing this in the States, trying to get everything resolved. And they're like, "Oh no, we can't reschedule your cab. You have to book a new one from scratch, and we can't refund it. We can't cancel. You have to pay a fee for this and that." I'm like, "All right, forget it. You know what? I'll hail a cab when I get to Heathrow. Forget about it." So we finally get to London Heathrow, and there's a long line of people waiting for cabs, and we tell we finally get up there. I got 3 or 4 luggage carts, and it's hot. It's August. Everybody's been in the same clothes for like 24 hours. Thank God the kids have been really good, not crying or complaining, but everyone is tired and hot and sweaty, and it's just nasty out. And so we finally get to the end of the line for the cabs in London Heathrow after we go through security and, customs and all that. And we tell them where we want to go, and it's on the complete opposite side of London. And the first cab driver is like, "Nope, I'm not taking you because it's too far." I'm like, "What? Are you kidding me?" So, okay, fine. The next guy pulls up, and he's not thrilled about it either, but he said, "Yeah, I'll take you." But he didn't offer to help us with the baggage or anything. I could tell he was not happy about it. Fine. So we put the luggage in, we get the kids in, fold up all the strollers, and we finally get in there. And I have to tell him where to go, and he's like, "Oh, it's about a 2-hour drive." And of course, there's an accident on the highway. And so it took like 2.5, 3 hours to get from the airport to my wife's grandmother's house. Oh, and mind you, the airlines had lost the luggage in the midst of all the transfers and delays and rerouting that we had to do, which I kind of figured. So we had we had lost most of our luggage. We lost at least 2 suitcases worth of stuff. So all the baby stuff and all of our clothes, we did not have. We only had our carry-ons, which we did have quite a few carry-on luggage, which is why the cabbie was not happy, I think. Plus the fact that he was going really, really far. But anyway, it was just inconvenience after inconvenience, roadblock after roadblock. And so we're sitting in the cab. We're finally in London after almost 24 hours. And we are driving there, and he tells us we got a 2-hour ride, so okay, fine. I guess we got plenty of time to get to know each other. So I strike up a conversation with the cabbie, and we start talking, and he's telling me about his life and asking me about what I do, and I tell him about divine intervention, and he's very intrigued with that. And we talk about everything from Brexit to miracles and God and religion and what's happening in England and all sorts of things. And we really had a good rapport after a while. He really started opening up. And after like an hour or so of talking to him, my wife just turns and looks at me, and she's like, "Yeah, you got to pray for him when we stop." And we were thinking, and it entered my mind, you know what, maybe all of this delay and inconvenience was for this man. And I started to think that, and I was able to witness to him about Jesus and talk to him. And then my wife and the kids went to sleep at this point. I had another hour or so to talk to the guy on my own. And when we finally got to our destination on the complete opposite side of London, I asked him, I said, "Hey, have you ever prayed to receive Jesus? Do you have peace that you know where you're going to go when you die?" And he's like, "No, I never did. I don't know." I said, "Would you like to be sure? And would you pray to accept the Lord in your life?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd like to do that." So he turned off the cab, and I got out, and I'm like totally sweaty and nasty. Been in the same clothes for 24 hours or so, and just exhausted. and, walk over to the side and lay my hand on his shoulder and pray for him and lead him to faith in Christ. And it was such a beautiful, sweet moment. And I look back on that and I say, okay, Lord, all of that inconvenience, all of that, rerouting and all the extra money I had to pay, the extra fees and this and that. Yes, it was a huge inconvenience, but it was all for the soul of that one man to maneuver me to be in front of this man who needed the Lord and who would be receptive to the gospel. And to think about just the very day before talking about this on the air with Fieldy and then having this happen the very next day, it was just God showing me, if you're willing to be inconvenienced, if you look for the opportunities, look beyond the inconveniences, look beyond your frustrations, and ask the Lord, what are you trying to show me here? Who am I supposed to speak to? What are you trying to say to me in this moment? I think he'll have a divine intervention for you, just like he did for me. So I want to let that be an encouragement to you, because, man, that was powerful. That incident was just another clear example of God showing me just how much he loves each and every one of us. He's calling out for people, and he'll go to great lengths to try and reach people, even so far as to inconvenience a person who might be a willing vessel to be able to be used by God. Oh, by the way, that cab ride, that was like a $275 cab ride too. But all the inconvenience, all the delays, all the extra expense, it was worth it for the soul of that one man. That's how much God loves each of us. Anyway, I've spoken enough on that topic. I want to get to our special guest without further ado. Our first guest today is J. Warner Wallace, who I mentioned is a cold case homicide detective. He's a popular national speaker and an author of Cold Case Christianity. He's been featured repeatedly on Dateline, Fox News, and Court TV, and is a member of a 3-generation law enforcement family. Jim and his wife have 4 children and live in Southern California. I caught up with Jay at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Nashville, Tennessee, and I want to apologize for the audio quality of this interview because it was done live on site. So with that in mind, let's get to our interview.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us on Divine Intervention Radio. It's an honor to have you.
Glad to be here in this great, crazy, noisy background at NRB convention.
Yes.
That's great.
I love the atmosphere here,
Yes.
and it's just an amazing place, electric with energy.
It is.
And the Spirit of God is here. I've been hearing some amazing stories, and I'm excited to get to yours. You've done so much with Cold Case Christianity, and you've got a book series and a podcast, and you're doing so much. But for anyone who's not familiar with you, can you give us a little bio on you, maybe some background, maybe how you grew up and what it was like for you, and how you came to faith in Jesus in the first place?
And I always am hesitant to give my testimony. I'll talk about that later. But,
okay.
But I'll just tell you that I was not raised in the church. Raised in Southern California, ultimately kind of trained in the arts. Was a designer, came up through school, became an architect, got my master's degree in architecture. Okay. My dad was a police officer, though, and it's got a very magnetic draw. And ultimately, I ended up working for the same agency that he did, spent 25 years working mostly homicides and cold cases. And my work, for the most part, ended up on television because, well, number one, we're in Southern California, so we're pretty close to NBC Universal. Right. And Dateline Films, is kind of stationed there. And it got to meet a producer early on, and so all of our cases, especially the ones that went to trial, all ended up on Dateline. I think I've been on Dateline more than anybody else.
Wow.
So a lot of those cases, kind of informed my process. And I was not a Christian, because you can grow up in Southern California and really not interact with Christians.
Wow. Yeah.
At least I did. I mean, I didn't know anybody. No one ever invited me to church until I was much older. I was probably in my 30s, early 30s, when I met an officer. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't think much of Christianity, and I usually mocked the Christians I met because I just didn't see any reason to believe there was a God to begin with. And the Christians I met could not defend what they believed anyway. If I pushed back even the smallest way, they would crumble.
Wow.
And it became almost comical. And I had another officer I worked with who later on promoted up the ranks and became my supervisor, but back when we were just officers, we would meet Christians, young Christian officers in their 20s and 30s, and ask them simple questions, and they couldn't answer those questions. The other group we would always meet were the people who were taken to jail who would tell us they were Christians, and we met a lot of those. And so I just didn't have any real respect for Christians in general and for Christianity, but it didn't seem like it was that transformative in the lives of the people who were taken to jail anyway. So I remember taking one guy to jail. I watched him I was working on a surveillance team, and I watched him commit a robbery of a home savings back in the day in Long Beach, California. And I was the guy who watched him go in, do the robbery. He comes back out. We chase him down, get in a pursuit. We end up taking him to jail. He's in the back of my car, and he's telling me how he got saved.
Would he get saved in the back of your car?
No, he didn't get saved in the back of my car. I was not interested. But I remember listening to his story and thinking to myself, okay, so if this is what it is, I mean, he would say that he knew he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing.
Okay.
But it didn't seem like it had this kind of transformative power in his life anyway.
Not a good witness.
Not a good witness. So I was just stood at that position where I was not interested in Christianity. My wife was more interested in God's existence and had kind of a cultural upbringing that led her to encourage us to go to church. And I had put it off for a number of years, and we were in this one city where we live in now, probably about 3 years before she talked me into going. And but when I went, the pastor was clever enough to pitch Jesus in a way that I could catch him. He said that Jesus was the smartest man who had ever lived.
Wow.
And so
that would appeal to your intellect.
Yes, and being prideful, I thought, no, that can't be true, especially given that some of the people I had met that didn't seem like they could defend what Christianity stood for. I thought, well, I'm going to buy a Bible and see what this Jesus of Nazareth had to say. And I honestly thought he may have been a real person, and like Confucius, he might have said a bunch of smart things, or like Buddha, so I could glean out the wisdom statements of this ancient sage. But that was really all I was interested in. So I read through the Gospels and was struck by the eyewitness texture of the Gospels, because I work a lot of old cases in which the witnesses are no longer available to me. Cold
I was
cases
going to
are
ask
like
you
that.
about that. For anyone who's not familiar with the terminology, what is a cold case?
So there's only one kind of case that we would consider to be a cold case, and those are murders, because there's no statute of limitations on a murder. So a robbery can go cold, but after a certain number of years, it'll close automatically, because the legislation is such, that statutes are such that you cannot go after a robbery after a certain number of years. You can't go after a burglary.
Is that different in each state?
It's different in each state, but it's pretty consistent. And but homicides nationwide have no statute of limitations, so they stay open.
Okay.
And so our cold case unit works nothing but homicides.
A cold case, is that something where there's no more leads? Or
so what it just means is that it just didn't get solved in the first year that the investigators were working at.
Gotcha.
And so we could have a cold case that's just 2 years old, or 3 years old maybe, let's say that. Because usually a detective will get assigned a case, and as long as he's in the unit, he's going to be working that case, even though it doesn't solve in the first year.
Okay.
So if he's in the unit for 5 years, he'll probably work that case for 5 years. But once he leaves the unit and it was assigned to him, the next guy who comes in is probably not as ambitious about it, because he's got his own caseload.
Right.
It's now going to take on that cold case status.
Okay.
So I focused on the more difficult and the oldest cases first, for really practical reasons, because those witnesses are going to die.
Right.
And so I have to get at them. And so my cases were usually in that 35 to 25 year range.
Wow. So,
but they're very similar to working this case from the Gospels. You have supplemental reports in which you have no access to the eyewitnesses often, and even sometimes the report writer is now deceased. Well, those are like the Gospels, right? You have no access to what say, Luke is chronicling, because he's telling us that he's using eyewitnesses. Well, they're not available to me, and Luke's not available to me as a report writer either.
Right.
So I got to figure out what happened, and that's what I did. Is I simply worked through the Gospels, and at the end of it, became convinced that they were telling me something true about Jesus. Now, that's a weird testimony.
Well, I like it though, because it's kind of unique, because you're using your skills as an investigator, as a cold case homicide detective, and applying it to the Gospels. And what you found, that they actually stood up to the scrutiny, and they were convincing.
Yes.
Now, for someone who's not familiar with the work of an investigator who's coming out, can you kind of break it down in a layman's terms, why the Gospels held up?
Yeah. So there's ways that we evaluate eyewitnesses in jury trials, and there's a series of usually jury instructions that if you were sitting on a jury, at some point you're going to hear these instructions, and one of them is going to be a list of questions that jurors are allowed to think about. in their head as they're listening to eyewitnesses.
Right.
And so those break down into 4 general categories. Questions you would ask. Number 1, is that guy really there to see what he said he saw? Was he present really? Because sometimes people will tell you they saw something, but then you can figure out, well, actually they weren't even in the state at the time. There's no way they could have saw that. They're lying.
Right.
So that's one of the things. 2, can they be corroborated or verified in some way, even if it's just a touch point, small thing? Is there any way to corroborate even a small percentage of what the witness is telling you? 3, do they possess? Have they changed their story over time?
Okay.
Have they been honest and accurate about other things? That's the kind of thing we're looking for. And 4th is, do they possess a bias that would cause them to lie? And you're allowed to evaluate witnesses under those 4 criteria.
Okay.
So I thought that would be fair then to evaluate what's happening in the Gospels under those 4 criteria. So I just used that template and started investigating. Well, number 1, are they present? The question is, how early are the Gospels actually written? Could they have been written by people who were really there? Because a lot of skeptics will claim they're written 200 years after the fact, and therefore they can't be trusted as eyewitness accounts. So I had to figure out a way to get down to how do I know when these were actually written? That was a big deal for me. That actually solves a lot of other problems, because if you're going to lie about Jesus, the best thing to do is to wait until everyone who knew Jesus is dead. And if you'll wait for that, then you can say anything you want about Jesus. But if you're going to lie about Jesus early enough where, number 1, people who knew the real Jesus would know if you're lying, and 2, in a region where they actually knew him, that's a problem. So the question I had was, do we have good reason to believe that these were written in the region early? They are. I mean, they are written early, and I can make the case for that. But that's what I try to do in Cold Case Christianity, is just talk about why I think that case is so strong.
Okay.
And so we go through that process, but that's really how I evaluate. That doesn't make you a Christian.
No.
That just gives you belief that.
Okay.
But once I started to read through the Gospels to see what they said about me, not what they said about Jesus, that shifts you toward belief in, because it really describes your need for a Savior. And if you're honest with yourself, I never would have trusted those kinds of claims. And a lot of Christians who would approach me would start with that, with my need for a Savior. Why? Okay, look, a lot of us who are arrogant enough, especially working in law enforcement, where we're called in to arrest bad guys, don't see ourselves as bad guys.
Right. I was going to ask you, because you dealt with, as a homicide detective, you dealt with the worst of society all the time. Not only having bad witnesses as Christians that you saw, but dealing with ugliness. And I can understand how that would cause you to think there's probably no God, or he's irrelevant, or why doesn't he stop this?
Well, it wasn't. I never had a thing with the problem of evil, and that's something I deal with a lot now when I speak around the country, especially with youth groups. Like, how do we account for evil? Given that it's supposed to be an all-powerful, all-loving God. If he's all-powerful, why hasn't he stopped it? If he's all-loving, why doesn't he care to stop it? I mean, that's the problem, is how do you reconcile an all-powerful, all-loving God? But that was never something that, I think I've been so conditioned. People will say, well, how do you deal with these kinds of murders and sex crimes and these kinds of things that happen? How do you keep your head on you? But I think what happens is the job simply vets out the people who can't do that. So in the end, if at the end of a career I'm here talking to you and I'm not a complete head case, it's probably because the job would have vetted me out early, and I see this because people will get on a crime scene, on a murder scene, and they're uncomfortable, and they're clearly uncomfortable, and then they just leave the team. They get out of that team, they go to something else because they don't want to be in front of that kind of mess. I can get that.
God creates different people with different gifts
different things. And
my wife is a surgeon, and she does, she cuts people up, and she tries to show me pictures. I nearly gag. I can't even see it. I'm not cut out for that kind of work. I thank God for that there are people who can do that.
That's right.
And I thank God for people like you who can, we need, unfortunately, in a fallen, broken world, we need people like you who can combat this evil.
Well, and a lot of this is really what when I was a teenager, my dad would show me his cases because he was a homicide investigator, and so I remember at the time I couldn't handle that. I was not interested in that, and that's why I pursued a career in the arts. And I came to law enforcement for very selfish reasons.
What's that?
Well, when I was in my last year of grad school, I was at UCLA in architecture, and I was working for a firm that I thought would be the best firm I could work for on the West Coast. I was already working for that firm.
Okay.
So I thought this is going to be a great career. But I looked around the office, and creatives are incredibly intense. We're intense people. you have to be passionate about it. You have to think that this thing you're writing, this next book you're writing, is the best book that's ever going to be written, even though it's not. But you have to think that, or you'll stop.
Right.
Why would you write it, right?
So invest years of your life.
Yes, exactly. It's only true for architectural projects. And what I noticed is that everyone who was in that firm was intensely involved and intensely driven by their personal vision of whatever it was they were working on.
Mm-hmm.
And I was already with my wife. We had been together almost 10 years. And I just told Susie, I said, I don't see us here. I don't see anyone like us here. I don't see anybody who cares enough about marriage, who cares enough about a family, that would want to raise a family. I see a lot of broken people who are either divorced or just singularly focused on working 80 hours a week and don't even think there's a problem with that.
Wow.
And meanwhile, my dad was back working a civil service job as a detective, and there's a lot of extra hours if you're working homicide, but by this time in his career, he was a sergeant, and he was just, working a regular shift. And I thought, that job was friendlier to marriage and friendlier to family, I thought, in terms of the kind of commitment that would be required, or I could keep marriage a priority for me. And it was a priority for me. And I just didn't think the creative work in architecture would allow me to keep my marriage a priority. So I came into law enforcement for really selfish reasons. I thought it would serve my marriage better. And,
that's certainly commendable, though.
Yeah, but in the end, it turned out the creative side of what I was doing, because we have the most difficult cases that most attorneys, when we try to file these cases with the DA's office, they're like, no, this isn't fileable. There's no way we can win this. By the way, all DAs care about is, can I win it in front of a jury? They're not going to file a 50-50. This is part of the problem with this kind of work.
Right.
Is that DAs are elected officials, and in the end they will say, yeah, we win 97% of our cases. Well, the reason why they win 97% is they only file about 40% of what is being brought to them.
Right.
They're only filing the slam dunks.
Right.
So
and even those aren't even...
Right, even then they're losing 3%. I'm actually thinking, why are you losing 3% of these? You're only filing the ones...
Should be an open and shut case.
Exactly.
It's not always.
It's not always. So that's the kind of little secret about this kind of work. But I will tell you that these cases we bring to them are sometimes so difficult that they will not file them. So if I said, wait a minute, I'm going to show you what this is going to look like using my design principles. I create the visual imagery for the case, and I can show this. I can show them as I file the case what it's going to look like in front of a jury.
That's amazing.
And that's what gets cases filed, is because they say, okay, that is persuasive. It's visually persuasive. So it turns out God uses all of that stuff that I thought was all for a waste. I mean, there was probably 10 years of my early career working gangs and working patrol, working SWAT, where I'm thinking, why did I go through all that architecture school? But once I got assigned to robbery homicide, I realized that all of this is going to be pressed into service working with jurors. And by that time, I was a youth pastor.
Wow.
And we also were using this with millennials at the time, now Gen Z, in making a visual case for Christianity. And that's really where I think my testimony is a little bit different, right, is that I think that we have to help the next generation be able to see and articulate what we believe about God in a way that is different than maybe we've had to do for any other generation. I know that everyone says, well, yeah, every generation is new, but this is different. This is a generation that for the first time has been entirely saturated by the information age of media on smartphones.
Right.
They are digital natives.
Right.
And if you don't think this changes the way you present the gospel, or changes it's interesting to me that we have seen a decrease in the size of the church nationally, and people who claim a Christian identity at least, and most of that's in Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
Now, isn't that interesting? It's dropping about 1% a year. These kids are not becoming atheists because atheism is not growing 1% a year. What's growing is a group of people who have no religious affiliation. They're called the nuns, when they check the nun box when it comes to religious affiliation.
Okay.
But if you ask them, they all believe in a higher power.
Okay.
The vast majority will believe in some type of supreme being or higher power. They just don't accept Christianity. Why is that happening? Well, simultaneous to the rise of smartphones is the decline of Christianity. And here's why I think it happens. On smartphones, young people have absolute access to anything that they choose. They've got complete autonomy. They can choose whatever media they want. Streaming media services now are starting to outrank cable services.
Right.
You'll see that everyone can pick their own form of news, their own form of entertainment. They have complete autonomy. They can control whatever version of reality they want to experience. When it comes to ideas about God, they want the same kind of complete autonomy and control. In other words, I have a version of God, but it's my personal digital version, basically. It's my version, my autonomous version of God. And I don't want your... So in other words, Christianity offers a meta-narrative.
Okay.
But we are in a generation of young people designing their own micro-narratives.
Gotcha.
And they don't.
Wow.
They're rejecting the meta-narrative. There's not a one-size-fits-all for Gen Z. It's contextual to each individual. And why is that happening? Because they're able to contextualize everything now on smartphones. That's why I think for us now, it's going to be our challenge to help young people, number one, understand the nature of truth.
Right.
Are there objective truth guides, or is everything subjective?
And Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life."
The way, not a way.
No one comes to the Father except through me. So how do we get that objective truth to Gen Z? I think, well, obviously you're doing that with...
Yes, we're trying to with books, we're trying to with media, but a lot of this is us being able to explain to them that, yes, there are subjective opinions. I have my favorite dessert, but I don't have my view of what will cure a disease, like, say, tuberculosis. That does not change. I cannot say, well, in my opinion, NyQuil will cure my TB. Well, actually, no, there's an objective cure called isoniazid, one of the 3 antibiotics in a cocktail, that cures TB. If you don't have isoniazid, you don't get cured of TB. There are some things for which your subject, as a subject making a decision, you don't get to decide. That's grounded in the object called isoniazid. That's an objective claim about truth. Now the question is God, in which of these two categories does God fall in?
Right. Wow.
And so we have to help our young people see that, yeah, you have a subjective opinion. I want to help you explore that, and I want to celebrate that. But at the same time, there are lots of things. Is that a stop sign? Does your opinion get to change when that's a stop sign? No, that's an objective claim. That's an objective reality.
Right.
So all we do is help our young people realize which of these two categories does God fall in. Because what we're seeing is that people are far more comfortable in this generation crafting their own version of God than accepting what we want to say has been an ancient, objective truth about God.
Wow,
I love it. So it's important for us to move in that direction.
Well, friend, you're listening to Divine Intervention Radio. Our guest is J. Warner Wallace, and you can check him out and his books, Cold Case Christianity. He's also got a whole series of books here for Cold Case Christianity for kids, God's Crime Scene, and he's doing so much. Why don't you give out your website and how people can find you?
Yeah, you can find me at coldcasechristianity.com for all the adult content, and we have an academy for kids 8 to 12 called CasemakersAcademy.com. Casemakers Academy.
In the 30 seconds we have left, if there's someone listening who's not sure about Jesus, if he's real, if he's true, what would you want to say to them?
Well, I would say that it's more than just your subjective feeling today, because that would lead you to a number of different places. It's really about which of these worldviews, these claims about God, are true, and could you somehow measure them? Turns out Christianity stands or falls on an historical event that either occurred or didn't, called the resurrection. So I would just start there. Do we have any good reasons to believe that Jesus really rose from the grave? If he did, he's something other than an ancient wise sage. If he did, he's something special. We should be listening to what he has to say.
Amen. Well, J. Warner Wallace, thank you so much for joining us on Divine Intervention. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
God bless you.
You're listening to Divine Intervention with Daniel Fazina, and we'll return in just a moment.
I believe in miracles. I read the song passage at night so I can watch the way they prayed in olden times.
Hi, this is Jay Jackson, lead singer for Apologetics, that Christian parody band, and you're listening to Divine Intervention Radio with our good friend Daniel Fazina.
Welcome back to Divine Intervention Radio. I'm your host, Daniel Fazina, and we're at divineinterventionradio.com. I want to thank you for tuning in. If you're just joining us, we are continuing with our theme of law enforcement. Our guest for this segment is Sergeant Mike McGrew, and he's the author of A Higher Call to Duty. Sergeant McGrew is a 30-year police veteran, and he's worked some of his city's most gruesome cases, from the violent homicide of a suburban housewife to the devastating molestation of dozens of children by priests at a local Catholic church. He experienced the chaos during the LA riots and negotiated with a killer on live radio. And we're going to talk with Sergeant Mike McGrew right now. I got to catch up with him at the NRB National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and we recorded this interview live on site. So again, please forgive the audio quality. There's a lot of background noise, but I think Mike's testimony is really powerful, and I think it's going to really inspire you and bless you. It was a true honor to be able to speak with Sergeant McGrew, so let's go to the interview right now. Sergeant Mike McGrew, welcome to Divine Intervention Radio. You are on. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to meet you in person finally here at
wonderful NRB in Nashville, Tennessee. You have a really amazing story. You've been through a lot, but for anyone who's not familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you grew up and maybe how you came to faith in Christ?
Yeah, I grew up in a loving home, but I didn't know the Lord. My parents didn't know the Lord, and I kind of went off of you earn things by your own merit and take care of your own problems. And I went through high school, and I was wrestling. I was a national champion at Greco-Roman. I wrestled up at Cal Poly. I got injured.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, got
national
injured.
champion.
Yeah.
I tried wrestling once or twice. So I didn't care to roll around with other men in tights, though.
Yeah.
Didn't work out for me.
You better, you better get used to that.
Yeah.
But it was a great sport. I loved it and taught me a lot. I was injured when I was up at college working on my truck. A fan blade flew off my truck while I was running, and it hit my hand.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I had to have some reconstructive surgery and lost my scholarship, and so
that must have been devastating.
It was not good. When I recovered, I started to work to go to school, and so I was working construction in the trades, building houses, and then I just got to this place where I said, I'd like to get a job where I can work when it rains and have a kind of steady income.
Mm-hmm.
And so my dad was a firefighter. He was a fire chief, retired at Santa Barbara City Fire, and a lot of uncles. My grandfather was a firefighter, so I started looking at that. But then one of them said, "Why don't you, have you ever thought about being a cop?" And I said, "No, I never have." So I looked into that, and 6 months later, I was hired on. I was in the academy. I got a pretty rough beat when I was a rookie, and had a lot of shootings and stabbings and bar fights, all kinds of stuff. A lot of drug dealing back then.
This is in California?
Yeah, this is in Santa Barbara.
Okay.
And crack cocaine was big back then. So we had a lot of Los Angeles gang members come up.
Okay.
And a lot of that influence. We're about 90 miles north of Los Angeles.
Okay.
So I quickly went into the detective bureau. I was in there and started off in burglary and transitioned over into major crimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I dealt with the homicides, robberies, sex crimes, shooting, stabbings, child molest, those kind of things. So I dealt with the worst of the worst.
Now I wanted to ask you, this is before you came to faith in the Lord, but what did dealing with all this type of stuff, the worst of humanity, what did that do to your view of humanity?
It wasn't good. It wasn't good, to deal with people who are hurt that bad. I saw things that were just so evil that, it was horrible. And to see the effects of that on some of the victims, it took a piece of my heart every single time.
Sure.
So it's not like you can leave that at the office, you come home and it starts to build up. I did always see something powerful. In the worst situation, there would be something pretty amazing that would happen. And as a non-believer, I didn't know what it was, but it could be the strength of the victim. It could be the community coming around, somebody to help. There were just so many precious things that happened, in the midst of that. That's what kept me coming back.
Okay.
And, I know now that it's God's grace. But back then, I couldn't put my finger on it. But it did take its toll on me. And,
sure.
I lost 2 marriages. Post-traumatic stress injuries are things that sneak up on people. There's an isolation that happens, and then you just kind of shut down. And, it's not good. It's dangerous, and I was just seeking comfort through the things of the world, which is not a very healthy place to be.
When you say post-traumatic stress injuries, are you talking about psychological or physical?
Yeah, they call it post-traumatic PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. I like to refer to it as an injury because that's what it is. Disorder, infers maybe there's something wrong with somebody, but there isn't. Anybody that goes through a trauma, whether it's a veteran or first responder or a civilian, we can all experience trauma in our life.
Sure.
And really what it is, it's an injury that happens. It's a brain injury that happens, and it can be treated.
Okay.
So, I was about 20 years into my career, and my youngest son was diagnosed with, he was 12 years old, he was diagnosed with bone cancer.
Oh my gosh.
And so he lost his left leg, and he had to go through chemo, so we spent about 200 days a year in the hospital.
My gosh.
You know, the treatment almost killed him about a half a dozen times. So
I can imagine.
Yeah, my world was upside down. And, you know, now I was in this place where I had no control over this. And then at the same time, my other son became involved in drugs, developed a pretty bad drug addiction. And so, and, you know, I was fighting two fronts, and they were both something that I had no control over. You know, I didn't know what to do. And, you know, here I was, the guy that was called to fix everybody else's problems, but my own life was just unraveling itself. So I met my current wife. We went to our first date. She took me to a Chris Tomlin concert, and I had no idea what that was. And I just wanted to go out on a date with my wife.
How was the music?
The music was good. I loved Chris Tomlin.
Good.
But for a lot of reasons. But it was that night. It was the first time I ever heard him. And Louis Giglio was the pastor that was traveling with him, and he came out and spoke, and he gave a message that just hit me so hard that I couldn't believe it. You know, he went down the checklist saying, "Is there anybody out there who?" And he just you know, started to go down the list of all the struggles that I was going through and the things that were happening in my life, and I checked every box. And then he spoke about the love of Jesus and just the peace and the place to put your burdens down, and it just hit me so hard. You know, the Holy Spirit hit me so hard that night. It was just supernatural. You know, I was looking around 5,000 people, and I'm thinking, how does this guy know my story? You know? So
Isn't that amazing how God does that?
Yeah,
He'll call you out of a crowd of 5,000.
He did, and he did that night. So the next day, I went to my cousin, who's he's a police officer as well. He's a retired lieutenant now, Dan McGrew, and he was raised as a Christian. So his side of the family was raised. They knew God from a young age. And I said, "Dan, would you tell me about Jesus?" And he just smiled and said, "Yeah, you know, I've been waiting for this day." So he sat down and, you know, just started to talk to me about God, and it was then that I turned my life over to Christ and accepted Him as my Lord and Savior.
Had you ever been to church before? Or
no, you know, I'd always stayed away from church.
Okay.
I actually had some pretty bad cases. I worked, you know, some of the big child molest cases. One of them was mine in Santa Barbara. There was about 22 priests that were involved in molestation. So that's the kind of thing that kept me away.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, no, but you know, God's given me a heart for the Catholic Church too. I mean, I really love. I have some very close people on my ward council, you know, people that I confide in that go to the Catholic Church. So it's been, I'm not Catholic myself, but it's been a pretty amazing journey to see what God's done. But I first started saying prayers that were, you know, selfish prayers, asking God to fix this or fix that for me, you know, and then quickly I learned that the joy was in serving Him.
Right.
And I did, you know, so I just found that, you know, I just wanted more and more and more of the Word. I needed more of God, and prayed more and more every day for more faith, and that happened. And He would give it to me. About 2 years into my walk, my youngest son died. He had been...
From bone cancer?
Well, he had fought it for 6 years, and the cancer came back 3 times, hit his lung once, hit the other leg, and they didn't want to make him a double amputee, so they took all the bones out, and that never held, you know. The poor guy went through about 14 surgeries, major ones.
Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. I'm so sorry.
And he ended up committed suicide is what happened. He intentionally overdosed on his pills. And
so
he wrote a note, yeah, thank you. He wrote a note, and the note said, "It's nobody's fault. I love you all, but there's just something inside me I can't explain." You know? I didn't know what that was at that time, but I do now. That was the lies of the enemy, you know, that working on him. And but he died, and I was working at patrol, and they tried to break it to me easily, but I got called in the watch commander's office. He wasn't there. I asked another cop, you know, where's the watch commander? And he said he's over at a dead 18-year-old's house at this address, and then that was my son's address.
Oh my gosh.
So that's how I found out. I'm like, oh no.
That is like horrible way to find out.
It was. But those things don't always work out the way you try to work them out. Yeah. And I ended up going there. There was a sea of blue that's standing by, and I went in, and my son was lying on the floor, and I grabbed his hand, and, it was cold. It was cold here. But God began to show me some miracles, and He began to show me where my son was. One of the miracles was there was a lady that was his therapist, and she came in and she wanted to say goodbye to him, and he was laying in his bedroom. So I stood outside. I said, "Sure, go ahead." So she went in, and she wasn't a believer. She'd never gone to church, anything. And she was in there a while, and she came out, and when I saw her, she was pale. She was like ghost white, and she was shaking. She was trembling.
Wow.
And she was looking at me, and she said, "Mike, your son's with God. Your son's with God." And I didn't know what to say other than, "Well, thank you." 3 days later, she told me that. She said that, "Mike, I got to tell you what happened in that room." And so she sat down. She went in there, and she sat on the ground next to him, and she held TT's hand. My son's name was TT, Michael Thomas, but we called him TT.
Okay.
And she held his hand, and she said the next thing she knew that somebody had grabbed her right hand, her free hand, and made the sign of the cross over her body, and it just shook her so hard, that when that happened, she said, "I wasn't even thinking of that," and that's what happened. She said it was like somebody just grabbed her hand and moved it that way. And
so,
you
mean her own hand made the sign of the cross?
Okay. Her own hand.
Someone was moving it.
Yeah, she was holding his hand with her left hand. Her right hand was free, and then somebody, she said there was like, she said it was supernatural.
Like
something grabbed. No, she didn't see anything, but it grabbed her hand and made the sign of the cross.
Wow.
And it wasn't her. And so to see that reaction, God's.
From a non-believer, no less.
Yeah, from a non-believer, and for her to sit on that for 3 days and then come back. God just works these miracles in a very special way. Miracles are they're amazing, but they're also very personal.
Yes.
And they have God's signature all over them. So, when you see them and you experience them, you'll know one for sure.
And when He speaks it to you, like you said, personally, nothing can take that away from you. No one can argue that away.
Yeah.
When it's that special and meaningful to you, you know it.
It is.
Wow. And you've experienced, in your career as a first responder, you've experienced many miracles. You were telling me one of the first ones happened when you came upon a person who was dead. Can you tell us about that?
There was a young lady that it was a call of a suicidal subject, and about 2 months before, God spoke to me about a resurrection, and it was kind of weird. I'm thinking, well, what? I didn't understand it. I was a patrol supervisor. I had to go to all the dead bodies in the city, when they happened. So I go into these different calls and just kind of stand there and not know what the Lord wanted me to do, until this one day when there was a suicidal subject call. 2 officers responded. They went to the house. They couldn't get in. They couldn't find the person. They called me because they had to kick the door in. And by the time I got there, they had found her, and she was hanging. She hung herself from the rafters of the detached garage.
Oh boy!
So they cut her down, and we laid her down on the driveway, and she was dead. She'd probably been hanging there for 20 minutes. She was dead. Her eyes were fixed and dilated. Her pupils were fixed and dilated. Her eyes were open.
No pulse.
She was blue. No pulse. She was dead. And I've done a lot of CPR. I've been involved in that. Cases where this is the person that is going to, you got a chance. But in this case, it wasn't. It was somebody who was dead. I knew she was dead. But the paramedics showed up. And right as they showed up, as I was standing over her looking at her, God said, "This one, you pray over this one." And I said, "Okay." So I started to pray over her. And the paramedics started to work on her, give her kind of like a courtesy CPR, they weren't expecting anything. So I reached down and I knelt down next to her, and I had a hold of her foot. And they worked on her for about 10 minutes, and I kept praying. And I felt that the presence of the Holy Spirit, just like we do when we're worshiping in church. It's just that it was no different, and that was happening. And I looked up, and her eyes gently closed. And then one of the firefighters jumped back startled, and said, "She's got a pulse." And then the other firefighter jumps back and says, she's got a blood pressure. And so they didn't know what to do. Yeah, and I just said, praise God, and I was just praising the Lord right there. And so they had to rush and get a stretcher to put her on because they weren't even ready to transport her. They didn't think that was going to happen.
Wow.
The last thing on their mind. So they got her on there, and there was a couple other cops that were standing around when that happened.
At this point, she's been gone at least 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And there was a couple other cops that were standing around me. And so they took her to the hospital. I got a hold of the mom, and I didn't tell the mom what happened other than I said, I was just praying for your daughter, but she was in bad shape. And so the next day, in the locker room, those cops that were there were praising Jesus, and one of them wasn't a believer. But they saw the miracle, so they saw that. That's how God, He uses miracles to point to Jesus.
Absolutely.
So that's what happened.
Did that woman or that girl, did she recover?
She didn't. So for about 3 or 4 days, she lived, and she was in the hospital, and then she died in the hospital. But I knew the gift that God was giving to that mother and to that family to hold on to a warm hand, to say goodbye to a loved one. That was a gift.
Right.
Because I knew what it was like to hold my son's dead when he was dead, his cold hand. And I knew that gift. But I also knew God was working with something with her, He's faithful to the last breath. And so there was something going on there, and there's something going on with the family. So, we don't know what God's doing in these situations, but I saw a miracle. I know that.
Yeah, He could have been speaking
to her. The cops behind me saw a miracle. It's something to testify about.
I love it.
Goodness, yeah. So it was a miracle.
Wonderful. Well, Sergeant McGrew, we've only got a couple minutes left. Why don't you tell me about it's called At Ease, right? Your foundation. What do you do with that, and what's it all about?
About 5 years before I retired, I retired 3 years ago. Started a program called At Ease, and God put it on my heart to help other first responders that were dealing with post-traumatic stress issues. And the barriers were that you had to go talk to your supervisors or your bosses before you could get help, and that was dangerous because you could lose your job, or there was a stigma that you couldn't handle it, or there's a lot of reasons why people didn't get help. So as I prayed, God brought the right people around, and we ended up with a foundation that raises money through the community. We have a helpline where they can call and then get matched up with a trauma-trained therapist that's been vetted and knows how to deal with these situations. I also have a prayer ministry that runs alongside of that as well. So, last year, just in our small little Santa Barbara area, we served over 600 first responders.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
How can people find your work online?
So I have a website for At Ease. The website is at-easesupport.com. And then I have a website. It's Sergeant Mike McGrew, SGT Mike McGrew, McGrew.com. You can go there to learn more about me, about the book, A Higher Call to Duty, which is available on Amazon as well. It includes a lot of these stories. And it's probably the best way to find out more.
All right, our guest today on Divine Intervention Radio has been Sergeant Mike McGrew. Please check out his book, A Higher Call to Duty, the unimaginable true life story of Sergeant Mike McGrew. You've heard a little bit of his testimony here, and unfortunately we're out of time, but I could talk to you all day about this kind of stuff, and you've had such an amazing, illustrious career, and what a life. So many things that God has done in your life. Thank you for sharing just a little bit of it with us here on Divine Intervention. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for having me on here.
Sure. God bless you.
God bless you.
Well, friend, thank you so much for joining us, and tune in next time as we bring you another exciting episode of Divine Intervention Radio.
You've been listening to Divine Intervention with your host, Daniel Fazina. You can email Daniel at divineintervention@mail.com. That's divineintervention@mail.com. All programs of Divine Intervention are available online at divineinterventionradio.com. That's divineinterventionradio.com. Join us next time here on Divine Intervention.